Hello, this is Amin, and you are watching session 49 of ASP.NET Core MVC tutorial. In this session, we are going to talk about seed data with Entity Framework Core, and also we update the model and sync the database, and also we will talk about revert synced migration. As you can see, we can seed data to the database inside the DB context, and as you can see, we can override the OnModelCreating method, and with ModelBuilder we can seed the data. If we want to know what is seeding data, it means add some demo data to the database at the time of migration. For example, if you want to add some record to the categories table or other tables that you have, you can seed the data at the time of the migration, and your database would have this record of data that you port from the DB context and through the seeding data. Let's flip to Visual Studio and first seed the data inside the DB context, and then I will talk how we can seed the data with the external extension. This is the project that we have been working so far throughout this tutorial, and I am going to DB context that I have created for this web application, which is web app DB context. And here I can add one override method to seed the data. Here I'm using override keyword and then on model creating, and as you can see, one protected override method of on model creating, which has void results, is created an object of model builder, and with this object of model builder I can see the data, and I want to add some data inside the category table that I created in previous sessions. I don't need this line of code, that's why I remove it. And here with Model Builder, I want to add data inside the category. That's why I should use entity, and my entity is category. And then open and close parentheses. For seeding data, I should use HasData method. And inside this one, I can add the data that I want, and I can create a new category. And inside this one, I can add the data that I want. For example, its ID is equal 1. Its category name would be bill, and category description. And also I can set the property of active, as I'm using category active option enum. I'm using category active option, and it is yes. And I can create another record for category table. I copy this object and paste it here, and I change the ID to 2, and here is grocery, and I change the description. And now I use add migration command, start the migration and seeding the data inside the database. For this purpose, I'm using package manager console. And here I use add migration command, and I call it seeding category data. And then I'm updating the database to see whether my seeding data will be appeared there or not. Update database built successfully, and I'm checking the database inside the SQL Server. And here inside the cost DB, you can see I have category and cost. And inside the category, I check the data. And here you can see I have the records that I'm seeding through DB context. Also, I can add several records here, but if I want to keep DB context as clear as possible, I can see the data through an external model builder. For this purpose, I can create one external class, which I can name it seed extension or any meaningful name. And then I use the model builder to seed the data. Then inside the DB context, I just use that class to seed the data. Let's implement this change as well to the project and to see how we can seed the data with external extension. I close these classes, which is related to previous migration. And here I create a class inside the model, and I call it seed extension. The extension should be a static class. And inside this one, I should create a method to seed the data inside the database. And I create a public static void class, which I call it seed. And as an input parameter, I use this and then model builder. I should add the namespace, which is inside the Microsoft.Entity Framework core. And I'm adding the namespace. And I create an object of this one. And here, I just copy the code that I implemented here. And I'm using the model builder to create a seed data. And I just add another object of category to have more data inside my category database. And I create the ID 3. And here is rent. And this category is assigned for recording rental cost. And I save it. I explain again, I just created a class which is static, and inside that class I use a method public static void and I call it seed, and inside that one as an input parameter I use this and I create an object of model builder, and with that object of model builder I seed the data as I mentioned earlier inside the DB context. And this time I'm going to the DB context and use the object of model builder. And you can see I have seed here as a method. And with this way, I can add all the data inside this extension. And then just I add the extension here inside the DB context. And let me add migration again to check whether this extension is working or not. For this purpose, I'm going to Package Manager console and add migration command. And here I use the name adding more seed data to category. You can see the class which is related to migration is created, and just I update the database. And through SQL Server Object Explorer, I'm going to cast DB and category and check the data. And as you can see, the third record is created with the extension. And you saw how I can see the data with the DB context and also with the external extension. In the continuation of this session, I'm talking about the syncing the database with the models. During the implementation and during the development of software, we need to modify the models to meet our requirement, and we should sync the model and the domain models with the database with the add migration and update database. And I'm talking more about the migration in this session. For example, I want to add one more property inside the cost database to store the image of the invoice that I record. For this purpose, I'm using property, and the property type is a string, and it is invoice image path. And I use add migration to check what I have and to sync these changes to the database. As you can check now, inside the cost database and inside the column, I just have ID, amount, registered data, comment, category ID, and payment method. And now I want to sync the data model with the database. For this purpose, I use add migration command, and here I mention add invoice image path to cost entity, and I run the command. You can see I have a class which has two parts and two methods, up and down. If I update this database, this changes, which is related to add a column, which its name is invoice image path, and inside the cost database, its type is nvarchar maximum, because I haven't used any data annotation to limit the length of the data inside the invoice image path, and it is nullable. And it has another method which is down, and if I remove this migration, it is remove this image invoice image path from the snapshot of this migration. If you look at the migration, you can see for each migration I have one class which contains the changes, and all of them has two parts, up and down. And when I use update database, the up method is running, and the changes inside the up method is implemented inside the database. And when I remove the migration, it is the down method will be implemented, and the changes inside the down is removed from the snapshot of this DB context. If you look at here, I have a file which its name is web app DB context, which is name of my DB context, and at the end of that one I have a snapshot. If you look at the snapshot file, you can check the situation of the model and the last migration that I have. If you look at here, you can see I have category model which has ID and active field, category name, and description, and its key is ID, and its table name is categories. And also it has data, which is the data which I see in the this session. You can see the data, and here inside the cost, you can see I have the properties ID, amount, category, comments, invoice image path that I just added, and payment method, registered date, and its key is ID, and it has a unique value which is category ID, which is a foreign key, and the rest of the data which is related to the relationship between the data. But if you look at here, I have image paths here. I want to add another property to the cost and check whether the snapshot will be changed or not. For this purpose, I'm going to cost model again, and I add another property. Its type is a string, and its name is invoice image alt. And then I'm using add migration, and its name is add invoice image alt to cost. I run this add migration. You can see it is created another class which has two parts, up and down, and it's related to add column image invoice image alt. And if you look at the snapshot, you can see the invoice image alt is added to the snapshot of this file. If I remove this migration, you can see the class which is related to add invoice image alt is removed automatically, and the snapshot file is updated, and we are not able to see invoice image alt data. And if I remove again, another migration, you can see we back to previous step, which it doesn't have invoice image path as well. And if I run another remove migration, you can see I receive an error which is related to the current migration, and it's mentioned this migration, which is adding more seeding data to category, has already been applied to database. That's why I am not able to remove the migration which already synced with database. And I will talk how we can revert it, but now I want to add these two fields first to the database. And I'm using this migration. And I call it add invoice image path to cost. And then I update the database with update database command. And if you look at the database, you can see inside the cost, I will have another property. Let me refresh the database. And here you can see I have invoice image path property and field. And let me add another property to cost, which is type is a string. And its name is invoice image alt. Let me save it and run add migration command. Its name is add invoice image alt to cost. The file is created successfully and the snapshot, of course, is updated. Let me update the database. Database is updated, and if I look at the cost, after refreshing the cost table, you can see I have invoice image alt and invoice image path. Also, I have another table here which is related to history of migration. If you look at the history of migration inside the data, you can see I have the history of the migration, and I have the version and the migration name that I use. The latest one is add invoice image alt to cost. And if you try to remove, for example, the latest migration, which is already synced to database, you can see I receive an error which I explained earlier. I try again and I want to remove one migration, which should be remove the latest migration, which is related to add invoice image alt, and I'm not able to remove it because it is already applied to database. For reverting the migration which is already applied to database, I should use update database and name of the migration that I want to be reverted. For example, I want to back to add invoice image path to cost. I copy the names from here, and here I run update database, and I mention the name of the step that I want to be reverted. The project is run successfully. I refresh this one, and you can see I remove the migration that I applied inside the database. And if you look at the cost table and look at the column, you can see I don't have invoice image alt property anymore. And now I can remove the migration which is related to add that property to the database. And you can see I successfully removed that migration. If you look at the snapshot file, you can see inside the cost entity, I just have ID, amount, category ID, comment, invoice image, payment method, registered data. and I don't have invoice image alt anymore, and we can revert the migration which is already applied to the database with the update command and name of the step that I want to revert, and then I can remove the migration which is related to that one. I can even step back to any step that I want, and then I should remove the migration which I don't need. And here inside the cost database, I don't need this property anymore, and I remove it from here, and I save the project. In this session, we first try to seed data with the DB context, and then we create one external extension for this purpose and use that external extension for that one. Then we talk about how we can sync or domain model with the database, and we talk about add migration and the class which is created after the add migration, and a snapshot file which contain the latest changes of the domain model which will be applied on the database. And then we talk about the revert synced migration, and we discussed about how you can revert the migration which is already applied to database with update command. I mentioned the step that we want to be at that step, and then we can remove the migration which is not required anymore. Thank you for watching this session. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and on our social media channels. Once more, thank you for being